Hello, this is Ash, the founder of Schemantra, and today we are going to build a CreativeWorkSeries schema. Before we start building the CreativeWorkSeries schema, let's look at the structure of it and how we are going to build it. So CreativeWorks schema is a group of related items, typically but not necessarily of the same kind. Unlike ItemList schema, which is general purpose structured data for a list of things, CreativeWorks schema doesn't have to be the same kind. The emphasis of a CreativeWorks schema is going to be on published material, such as podcast, movie series, and things like that. If we look here, there are more specific types of CreativeWorks series, which is like a book series, movies, periodical, podcast series, radio series, TV series, and video game series. Anything we build using CreativeWorks schema can be applicable on those specific kind of schemas. So if you have a book series or a movie series, you can choose this kind of schema, which is more specific. But the same things we are going to do after is gonna be applicable for all of this. So let's start. For the sake of this example, we are going to build a CreativeWorks series with 2 podcast episodes. Of course, you can use podcast series on it, but to be more general and to apply for all kind of CreativeWorks series, we are going just to use the more general type of schema, and then we are going to connect it with the podcast over here. We go to schemantra.com, click start, and first we are going to make the podcast schemas, and then we're going to create the CreativeWorks schemas and connect it to the podcast. So let's start. Create new, and here we look for the podcast, and this is a podcast episode. Let's go submit. So before we start building the podcast schema, let's go and see how it looks like in Google. So if we Google podcast, and we can see here there are podcast rich snippets, and those rich snippets has name, date, description, and period. So this is what we're going to add here. First, we're gonna give it an ID. You can give it an ID of anything you can think of. This ID is going to be very useful later when we connect the schemas together. But you can call it any name seriously. So I'm gonna call it podcast 1. Go to name, structured data for, and we want the description, podcast about schema markups. Date published. So we have name, date, description, and then period. Here we can see the period of the podcast, and this is taken from the podcast length itself. It's not taken from the schema. So we don't have to add a period because it's not one of the requirements for creating a podcast schema. This is gonna be automatically chosen after Google crawler see the schema itself, and then it can compare it to the podcast published, as long as we put the URL on it. So if we go here and we put the URL of the single page of the specific page of the podcast, and then save schema. And now we create the second podcast. So we go here, create new, and then look for the podcast episode, and we call it podcast 2. The same information we can put here, but I'm just going to add the name, and everything else is going to be the same. So the name of, or the title of the podcast, or the name of this podcast is going to be, and we click save schema. So now we have 2 podcast schema. Let's go to the validator and check how they look like. This is the first one. If we want to take the code, we go to this view code, copy code, and let's go back and get the second podcast, and this is the second podcast. If you click on the view again, and this is the second code here, we can copy it and add it here. And if we run the test, we can see there are 2 podcast episodes. Each one has a unique ID. This is podcast 1 and this is podcast 2. If you click on any of them, it will show the details that we just added a while ago. Name, description, date published, and URL. The same goes for the second one. And now what we're gonna do is we have to include both of these podcasts in the CreativeWorkSeries schema and make them all as one schema. So let's go back and let's create a CreativeWorks schema. CreativeWorkSeries. This is what we want. Not this creative work. We want the series because we have a series of podcasts or any creative work that is going to be published. Click submit. And here we give it series. Just give it any ID we want. And on this schema, you can add all the information that is generally describing the series of podcasts you are producing, such as name, description, the date published, date ending, and all of this information. Save schema. So if we go to this and we click on it, select it, and we click on it. We click the plus sign so we can add another schema. Before we add the schema here, let's refer back to the flow chart and see how we are going to add the other schema. This is the CreativeWorks schema flow chart, and we can see here that these podcasts are related to the CreativeWorks schema with this kind of relation. It has part. So we want to look for has part and then add the other ones. So let's go back. Here we are on the add subschema page to CreativeWorkSeries, and we want to look for the has part relation. So this is the relation. So we go down, has part. This is has part. Add has part property through CreativeWorks schema. Here, this is a creative work, and the podcast is more specific type of creative work, or a book is a more specific type of creative work. So if we go here and if we add the ID of the podcast, so if we go, let's go back to the validator. As we can see here, we created 2 podcasts. Everyone has its own ID. This is the ID. So if we take the ID of the podcast, which is podcast 1, and we add it on the add schema page here, and leave everything is the same. Everything is gonna be the same. Just leave it blank and save schema. So here we added the first podcast, and then we go back to CreativeWorkSeries and we click the plus sign and we go to has part, and then we click on the CreativeWorks schema again and we add the second ID that we created. So we add the second ID we created. This is the podcast 2. This is the ID of the podcast 2. It's called podcast 2. We copy this, we go back here, and we paste the ID, and then we click Save Subschema. Now we added the 2 podcasts to the CreativeWorkSeries. If we go to the CreativeWorkSeries again, which is the root of these 2 podcasts, and we click View Schema, this is the code. Let's copy the code and let's go back and let's add this code here and click validate. And as you can see here, those 2 podcasts we created earlier are added to this CreativeWorkSeries schema. If we expand it, we look at the type. This is our type here, CreativeWorkSeries, and it has part, and the type is podcast episode, which is more specific type of creative work. And this podcast episode has all the information we put early on. The other podcast is here, and it has all the other information you can put on. So this is the code for a CreativeWorks schema that has 2 podcast episodes. Thank you so much for watching, and if you would like to see more of this, please subscribe and see you next time.